Welcome back. After the break, my name is Terje Lohndal. I'm the Vice Deputy Chair of the Humanities and Social Sciences section of the Academy. And I'll be chairing and moderating this discussion of Elster's talk. And we have two commentators first, and without any questions from the audience, and then we'll take all questions from the audience afterwards. And the first commentator is Ken Binmore. He is a British mathematician, economist, and game theorist, a professor emeritus of economics at University College London. He's one of the founders of the economic theory of bargaining, and he has made important contributions to the foundations of game theory and experimental economics. And he will address Elster's various notions of hard obscurantism and so on. Please, Professor Binmore.
Okay, can I be heard? Yes, good. Now, we just listened to Jon Elster talk about obscurantism, and I am here supposedly as an opponent. Actually, I'm not really an opponent because I really admire him for blowing the whistle on so much stuff that needs the whistle blown. And if I had his courage, I would be blowing the whistle too. But I'm going to, when I've finished saying a few things that I disagree with, then we will get on to where I agree with him. Let me just first say, he and I don't share much on the general principles. I think he makes a straw man of social science. There isn't just one social science, as he thinks. There's as many social sciences as there are people doing social science. And some of it needs the whistle blown on and some of it doesn't. And I certainly don't agree with what he says about science fiction modelers who happen occasionally to save society lots of money. You couldn't expect me to agree because I am such a person. And I write science fiction modelers, and to my other science fiction modelers here, I'm not going to defend you or me. I defended myself in a written form, and you can read that. I'll show you in a minute the reference. But it's true that we do sometimes save society lots of money. My own effort was the 3G telecom auction in the year 2000, which saved the British taxpayer $35 billion. And it just didn't happen by accident. It just didn't happen by accident. And I also, I also disagree with him about behavioral economics. In his book, he's very favorable to behavioral economics. He should be blowing the whistle there a little bit too. And so I've got an obscurantist scale here. And there's science at one end, and he shouldn't be blowing the whistle on science, but I fear he does sometimes. Most of what goes on in social science I put under the head of scholasticism, rather like a continuation of St. Thomas Aquinas with the same relevance to us. And then there's bullshit. What a hell of a lot of bullshit. And he doesn't condemn bullshit adequately, and doesn't attack dishonesty at all. And at the bad end of behavioral, I'm a behavioral economist, so I'm not condemning behavioral economics, but at the bad end of behavioral economics, there's a lot of dishonesty. So here is his range, as I understand it. And I think his range should be where I've put Binmore. And now, moving his range to the left would exclude me and my friends in the audience, and it would include these naughty guys in behavioral economics who do not care whether what they say is true. All they care about is advancing their careers. And if you think, what does Binmore know? Read this paper. we sent it to the House Journal of Behavioral Economics in a kind of mischievous way. We had 20 plus referees, nearly all of whom were self-appointed, and their referees' reports consisted of abuse. And I'm sure Jon gets a lot of abuse for blowing the whistle. I had a death threat amongst my bits of abuse. So the particular case study that we attacked was Fair and Schmidt on inequity aversion. And here is my reply to Jon on science fiction modeling, which one can read if one wants to. And where I am totally with him is in following the statistician David Friedman on fitting or predicting. You know, the gold standard of science is predicting. But what do social scientists do? And economists are just as bad as any others. They fit. They fit. Now, you know, fitting, what does it consist of? I mean, you have a model. This is your piece of theory. It's a model. And, you know, some models are plausible and some are not. So I'm only talking about fitting plausible models. And is it any good? Now, you know, it's not going to predict exactly, so everyone has a model of noise to explain why data actually deviates from the model. And you might call the noise, it's a model of bells and whistles. And each bell and whistle has a volume knob. You can turn it up and you can turn it down. And what fitting consists of is, first of all, choosing bells and whistles, and you're free to choose them as you like, and then to turn up and down using econometric techniques to minimize the deviation the data shows from the predictions of the model. And but that isn't the end. I mean, that's a perfectly respectable way to describe the data, perfectly scientific. But what researchers cannot resist is claiming that this fitting exercise is an explanation. An explanation. Now, to be an explanation, it's got to predict new data, not the same data from the same source. It's got to predict new data. It's got to be robust to changing the circumstances. And to what extent does this happen? Almost never. Almost never. In fact, in economics nowadays, I don't know, 20, 30% of practitioners know nothing else. They know how to do a regression, and that's it. This is what Jon calls curve fitting. I mean, people think curve fitting, old-fashioned thing, but when he says curve fitting, mostly what it is regressions, where the curve, you know, in simple cases is a straight line, but in more general cases, linear. All right. And this is, to my opinion, worthless. It's obscurantism at its worst. Okay? And it's worth reading David Friedman, incidentally, who's tried very, very hard to convince other statisticians of the same thing, not very successfully. Behavioral economics, and I've got Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize with Vernon Smith, and Amos Tversky, his longtime co-author, would have won the Nobel Prize too if he had been alive. These guys are not bullshitters, and they are not dishonest. This is the good end of behavioral economics. Jon is keen on their prospect theory, and so is everybody else. But the prospect theory, the reason is that prospect theory is important in the foundations of loss aversion. And people love loss aversion. I love it too, because it's probably correct, although there's no data supporting it, no proper data supporting it. I just have an intuition that probably it's correct. Now, prospect theory is a behavioral alternative to the economist's expected utility theory. It's not the only one. There are 4 or 5 others. In 1994, some very respectable, Colin Cameron is one of them, very respectable experimental economists studied all of the extant theories, including expected utility theory, taking into account the extra parameters. So prospect theory has quite a few parameters. For example, the reference point in this picture. You can choose it where you like. The degree of curvature of the value curve in this picture, you can choose that. When you take account of the extra parameters, the extra freedom allowed you to fit the model with extra parameters, they find that none of these models, none of them, do any better than expected utility theory. And expected utility theory predicts very badly. Right? Nobody has ever attempted to say why these guys in 1994 got it wrong. Nobody cares. Okay? I mean, this is obscurantism, not at its worst, because I'm about to show you its worst. It's Bayesianism. This is a picture of the Reverend Thomas Bayes, and this is his famous formula. And it's certainly correct for objective probabilities, long-run frequencies. But in social science, we don't have objective probabilities. We have subjective probabilities. And the obscurantists here trounced all opposition. They have obscured, first of all, the fact that Bayesianism is applied out of the range for which it was designed. And they have obscured the fact that direct psychological tests in the laboratory of whether people actually update using Bayes' rule without noise and bells and whistles. Do people actually update in the laboratory using Bayes' rule? And the answer is no, no, no. It's absolutely hopeless. And what about obscuring the range in which the theory applies? Well, who invented Bayesian decision theory? And the answer is Leonard Savage. In his book, Foundations of Statistics, 1954, on page 16, he says it would be preposterous, utterly ridiculous, to apply my theory except what he later calls a small world. I haven't time to tell you what a small world is, but it certainly doesn't include finance, and it certainly doesn't include macroeconomics. In fact, it excludes pretty much all applications. But, it's one economists completely over. At first, there was just a little group of statisticians. Now it's economists, sociologists, even psychologists who ought to know better. And what do? They fit. Okay, well, it's a plausible model. Of course, you can fit it. But it doesn't matter how much you fit it. It says nothing. And no wonder, Jürgen finds macroeconomics doesn't work. Finance doesn't work when they're using a bad theory, using bad dynamics. I've written my own attack on obscurantism, chiefly philosophical obscurantism, in this book coming out next month. I don't think I've got time. This gentleman is Derek Parfit. Yeah, you wouldn't think moral philosophers could be harmful, hard obscurantists. This guy, enormous harm by persuading health professionals that he and people like him know what's good for people. And I was going to say a rude word, they know nothing at all. Their methodology is worthless. And, okay, I'm getting worked up. I'm going to spend a few minutes, I haven't time for this. I spend a few minutes defending myself. This is me. And I do write science fiction models. Should really be a picture of William Vickrey, who won the Nobel Prize eventually for inventing the kind of auction theory that's used in large-scale situations. Or it could be Alvin Roth, who won the Nobel Prize recently for inventing matching processes. He saved lots of lives by using the theory in organizing kidney. Your mother perhaps will offer you her kidney, but perhaps you don't have the same blood group, so you need to find someone with the same blood group, and it's complicated, and Alroth shows how to do it. Right? When William Vickrey invented these fancy auction theories, and Alroth and other people invented these matching processes, Ewan would have said science fiction models. Right? And why are they science fiction models? Because they haven't been used yet. They cease to be fiction when they're used. Right? And this is not the only reason that people write science fiction models. That's me when I was a lot younger, and I still had my hair. There are other reasons. Physicists do it. When I was an undergraduate, for example, studying mathematics, I was taught what the orbits of the planets would be if the law of gravity was the inverse cube law. Now, you can't think of a science fiction model more science fiction than that. It was taught to us for a reason. It was taught for us to learn how to do such things for ourselves. Okay? And that's just one of many, many reasons that the models Ewan calls science fiction are used in physics, and not just in physics. Right? But that's enough. My chairman is surprised I'm finishing in time, but I finish in time. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you help?
Thank you very much, both of you, for your interesting commentaries. Ewan, do you want to have a brief reply before we open the floor for questions, or?
By brief? What do you mean by brief?
Like 5 minutes, if there's going to be any.
Yes, these were very rich and interesting comments. Let me see. Okay. Is this better? No? This is better? Yeah. Okay, so these were rich, interesting comments. To Ken Binmore, he endorses my criticism of regressions, which I didn't talk about actually in this talk, but which I do talk about in another context from which the talk is taken. He criticizes my adherence to behavioral economics and claims that I should have extended my criticism to that branch of theorizing, and he implicitly but not explicitly, I think, defends rational choice theory against the charge of obscurantism. I missed something there, because I think that rational choice theory imputes to human agents, people, capacities they demonstrably don't have of various kinds, and so they end up with science fiction models of ideally rational agents that have never existed and will never exist. So in that sense, I call them science fiction. Now, so what I'm puzzled about is what kind of value do these science fiction models have? And I clearly distinguish in my talk today, not in an original paper I sent to Ken, but in this talk, between economic engineering, which is a craft at which he obviously excels, and science, which tries to explain things that have happened. Maybe predict. I don't think there's much room for prediction, but I think there's room for retrodiction. That is, we can try to explain a past event by a mechanism, and we can ask, can this mechanism have excess explanatory power? That is, in addition to explaining the explanandum, can it predict other phenomena that nobody had thought of before? So we can verify whether those, does it imply other phenomena that nobody had thought about, and that would add the absolutely necessary excess explanatory power, as Richard Feynman said in his wonderful lecture on cargo cult science. If the explanation doesn't yield have excess explanatory power. It could just be curve fitting and essentially not add to knowledge. So let me very briefly give an example that I used in one of my books. Why are there more standing ovations in New York theaters for New York plays? Well, the playwright Arthur Miller suggested that it was simply because prices had skyrocketed, so that the audience had to applaud to convince themselves that the play was really good, so they got their worth. And so I think this is plausible, but of course just one explanation that fits the fact among others. So I thought of the following novel fact. Plays that are watched by audiences who have received their tickets for free from their employer should have fewer standing ovations, because they have not spent any money. They don't have to persuade themselves that they got their money worth because they didn't spend anything. Just, of course, these are not predictions, but retradictions of a fact that is observed, and then you have to generate a hypothesis. That's easy, and then add, try to find implications, hitherto unnoticed implications. That is novel facts. This is Imre Lakatos' wrinkle on Popper, as many of you will know. Now, to Jon Hylland Eriksen. Well, either the Ashkenazis are smarter or they aren't. There's a fact of the matter. And maybe it's been hard for the proponents of the two views to come to agreement, but that doesn't really affect what I was trying to say. If there's a fact of the matter, there's a truth, that's the truth we are trying to aim for. And the fact that, macroeconomists will never come to an agreement about anything, but there probably is a fact of the matter, even about when economic crises occur. But it's just too complicated. So, anyway, so that was 5 minutes, perhaps.
Thank you. Any immediate replies, or should we turn to the audience?
I'll just say one thing about rational choice theory. I actually did say in my talk, you can't deny it, rational choice theory doesn't predict human behavior very well, but it is hugely successful in evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology would be nowhere without what science fiction models in economics made of it, and game theory. And why is that? It's because animals are simpler than people. You can't just pretend that proper science, not social science, but physics and biology don't exist. When the things we do actually matter to physicists, as advances in statistics and game theory and biology, you just can't write it off and say it doesn't matter. It isn't science. It is science. It's what everybody understands as science. And because there are areas in social science which are total disaster, it's not a good reason for writing off the areas where it isn't. And that's too long as well. I'm sorry.
Well, just a one-liner. Rationality is not the same as adaptiveness.
Yes, Thomas.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I just like to reiterate that there is a lot of knowledge, and there is general agreement about what should count as knowledge, at least among people like us. And yet there is no agreement about the implications of that knowledge. So if you take a phenomenon like climate change, which is an obvious thing, why is it that so little happens? Why is it that in spite of the presence of and the existence of an enormous and convincing body of research on the facts and the causes of climate change, there is very little action? Why is it that other kinds of knowledge, which may be less far-sighted, more small-scale, more local in character, more beneficial to the politicians, perhaps, is given pride of place instead of the scientific knowledge that might actually make a difference. So I think that's one of the things that we might want to discuss, which is not really about truth, but about relevance and about the relationship between knowledge and power.
Good. So now we have about an hour for questions and discussions. You can address questions to any of the three people at the table. Please wait for the microphone before you start and identify yourself when you ask your question. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions and reactions or comments to the things we've heard so far. Yes, Nils first, and then I'll try to keep track.
I mean, Jon has talked about obscurantism. But in a way, the other way you can fall off is into scientism. And I mean, that's a challenge which I think we should take rather seriously. And so I was looking at this rational choice machine, this schema which you put on the screen here. I think you remember it quite well. So I've been trying to teach in courses using your nuts and bolts, and I've always stumbled over this scheme. Because what is it? What is it really? And if I interpret it correctly, I think it's a kind of, what do you say, a depiction of an ideal kind of politics. It's really geared to action. You can see that action is at the top of the scheme. And it's a little worrying for me that science, knowledge, is at the bottom right. It's this circle. That's where you put science. And it seems to me that you, I mean, this seems to be a way of subordinating science to politics, in effect, because the intentions of the actor are so dominating in this scheme. And just to put it very simply, you know Marx quite well, and he said that so far the philosophers, that means the scientists, have been trying to understand the world. What matters is to change it. The matter is to change it. It's a political aim. And I mean, this dictum of Marx, it's still on the wall in the entrance of the Humboldt University in Berlin. And so I'd like to ask you a little about what is the relationship between politics and science in your thinking?
So next, this is a diagram you had in mind, right?
Yes.
Well, this diagram, I think, is trivially adequate in the sense that this is what we do to understand the behavior. We ask, did the agent act in a way that realized his or her desire as well as possible given his or her beliefs? That's often an interesting question. Or where did the belief come from? Maybe in some respect it's rational if you want to kill someone to make a doll of that person and stick a pin through it. It's rational given that belief, but the belief itself is not very rational. And then even if, and then you ask, what makes a belief rational? Well, it depends on how well it fits with sort of raw information about the world. And of course, that information has to be collected, and you cannot collect too much or too little. But these are just trivial descriptions of what we do every day. Politics doesn't enter into this at all. Action here just means any given action, such as taking the 9:15 tramway instead of the 9:30 tramway, or whatever. So politics, action should not be understood as having anything to do with politics. Of course, politics matters for science, but mainly, I think, in a choice of problems, not in the choice of answers to those problems. That's also a trivial observation, but some people claim, of course, that much of science is tainted by politics, even in its conclusions. And of course, sometimes that is true. If the Central Bureau of Statistics are told by politicians to use this model rather than that model, because the first model predicts lower unemployment than the second, and the politicians don't like that, that would be a way, direct and sometimes observed case of politics directly influencing choice of models. But I think, in general, my diagram here is intended to capture something, I think, very trivial, something we do every day, more or less well. When we do it less well, it can be due to just sloppiness, or it can be due to interference of emotions and so on, which prevents us, for instance, from gathering enough information because we are too impatient to wait for that. So.
I just very briefly, I think we talked about climate science, and I mean this is completely irrelevant to the discussion about what science can do to climate politics?
Oh, I see. Well, it's not irrelevant because it's relevant because how do you form rational beliefs about or rational prognosis about future climate change given various scenarios? It's a very difficult scientific endeavor, both to decide how much information to collect, how many stations to have around the world, and also how many variables to include. Sometimes it seems perversely as if the more variables you include, the more uncertainty you get in the models. Now, that's not very desirable from the point of view of action against climate change. So I think thinking about climate change is extremely difficult. For instance, desires. What should we desire? What are the values we should attach to future generations? That's partly an ethical question, but partly also, I think, a factual question because it depends on how much we think technology will progress, and so that we don't need to benefit future generations because they will benefit from superior technology. So I think this, well, certainly not any conflict between this very general scheme, but maybe not, well, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, brief comment first.
Can I say, economists think this model is naive, right? You know, and just to correct it, you know, the arrow that says you shouldn't allow your beliefs to affect your preferences, it should point both ways. I mean, the assumptions lead to this model. Basically say a rational person doesn't allow their preferences to interfere with their beliefs or vice versa. But the reason we economists think it's naive is because we live in a world where rational choice theory is deduced from consistent behavior. That's why it works in evolutionary biology. If people behave consistently, and in this book, I've got no equations all explained. If people behave consistently in some context, then they behave as if they were maximizing a utility function and all the rest, right, with certain beliefs. It doesn't follow that they have probabilities. It's as if they had probabilities. Animals can't have probabilities. Most human beings can't think in terms of probabilities. Of course not. We're not responsible for this model. You know, the political sciences folk have naivized our theories, and we don't mind. You know, it helps you get ahead. You want to speak too?
Okay, another one-liner.
I think revealed preference theory, which was described here, is in a small minority among economists and is demonstrably inadequate for a number of issues, such as buying a new car.
Just to add to this, and also perhaps as a comment to Nils's question, I mean, one major difference between humans and sort of the evolutionary mechanisms of evolutionary processes is our ability to accept the idea of the global maximum. You know, the fact that instead of a local maximum, we don't need to improve our condition immediately. We can accept to suffer a bit if there is a prospect for us to improve our way of life or our quality of life later on. You know, you can have a dip. While you're a student, for example, you're poor, you live in a bedsit, you eat tomato soup, and so on, because you know that in a few years you'll be better off. In evolution, that doesn't work. You need to get the reward immediately. And this, I wanted to say this in order to just comment on desires and beliefs in the model, because desires and beliefs are informed by knowledge and by experience, but they are of different kinds. You have the long-term and the short-term, which is quite crucial when it comes to climate change. Do we think about the next election, or do we think about the condition of the planet at the next turn of the century? So that's a temporal dimension which differs, and we have both preferences and we have to juggle them. And then you have the scale, the small scale and large scale. Do I think about the future of my grandchildren, or my next utility bill, how to pay my next utility bill, or do I think about, you know, the planet, as it were? And we try to, and we do both. And what it is that one kicks in at the expense of the other is something that we need to understand better, I think, in order to deal with these large-scale challenges.
Briefly.
I respond to both of these things. You know, one, if you want to believe what Jon says about what economists think, look in a textbook, don't listen to him. And two, you never heard of squirrels. Haven't you seen squirrels putting away acorns for next year? You've probably never heard of cicadas. And I could go on and on. And we economists don't claim to have theories that work for everything, and you can name all kinds of things that we don't know how to solve. But you know, we're doing our best. But we can't be blamed for theories that we failed to invent that don't actually work. I'm not sure.
Next question, please.
Yeah, Gunnar Skibek, University of Bergen, philosopher. Thank you for your lecture. I have one question related to the starting point about truth. You mentioned then also interpretations, but you went straight on to explanations. And now my question is, what about, should we say, questions about the relative adequacy or inadequacy of concepts in various contexts? Would you take that into consideration? Do you see that as a relevant thing to bring into the question in addition to the question of truth of explanations? That's a question. Thank you.
I take that to be a question about definitions. That is, can correct definitions be true or false? Obviously they cannot. They can be useful or not. And often, so I have to tell this to my students all the time because they think there's such a thing as a correct definition of populism, or democracy, or whatever it is. So I tell them, well, you choose a stipulative definition. I learned this, of course, from Arne Næss some 6 decades ago. You take a stipulative definition and run with it. It has to conform roughly to at least one common usage, so as not to confuse people. But you take a definition and run with it. And it either to explain the causes of the phenomena thus defined, its consequences thus defined, or its normative properties thus defined. But I think I'm a pure and hard positivist and nominalist because I was taught by Arne Næss to be so.
Okay. I also got through ELA and Arne Næss. But the question is, though, that there are discussions about, for instance, in questions of modernization, what notion should you use? Some positions could be said to be less rich in concepts. There are discussions going on. It's very tricky, and it's related to cases. And it's not that there is one truth, but there are discussions. Should there be other concepts brought in? Are they too pure? Do they see enough of the thing that we are interested in? So, well, but you gave the answer. I disagree. I think there are discussions in philosophy, starting with that, but also into the social sciences about the relative inadequacy and adequacy of concepts in various cases, in addition to the question of empirical and explanatory truth. Okay.
Well, I don't think I can reply otherwise than by repeating what I just said. I'm sorry.
I haven't seen any other hands, but there might be hopefully more questions. Yep.
Helgevold, psychiatrist. Just a short question of relevance. According to more or less neuropsychological investigations, which parts of the brain is activated in different types of situations? Now it seems that if you have choice situations, about less than 20% of situations are involved in the frontal cortex, where one supposes to sort of deliberate which choice to do, and more than 80% are more or less automated or a bit habituated. And this means that customs are much more important than choices.
Pascal said 50%, Leibniz says 75% are the automaton, and just the remaining 30 or 25% are actually the mind. So I agree with the importance of custom or habit. But of course, these are in turn exponenda, and the evolution of custom is itself a complicated process that can be studied. And sometimes people try to deliberately choose to be able to do without choices. So there are all sorts of interesting issues that arise. But I think choice is interesting to study because it's sort of the link between choices and inputs to the brain are interesting and complicated, whereas custom is perhaps less interesting to study. Well, I'm digressing. I don't have any opinions on this, actually.
Tønneson, helt bak. Helt bak.
Stein Tønneson. I seem to remember, Jon, that you had a model similar to this some years ago, where you did not have information, but you had opportunity. And I wonder why opportunity has disappeared from the model and been replaced by information. Is it part of the beliefs, or is it because the opportunity can only play a role for the action to the extent that the one who chooses knows about the opportunities and constraints? That's my question.
Yes.
Yep.
Just a tangential comment that Professor Binmore reminded me of, that rational choice theory has been elevated to a theory, whereas it really doesn't deserve that kind of stature. Probably everybody on the street is a rational choice theorist, in that they believe they're going to behave consistently, and they don't value delayed things as much as they value imminent things. And the fact that an economist, Samuelson, put that together as a formula, more or less a throwaway formula that he sort of assumed everybody went by anyway in 1937, doesn't really make it a theory. It's sort of common sense that we're starting from. That's all. I just was glad that Professor Binmore had pointed that out, because I have felt that as well.
Can I respond to that? I mean, if you put ordinary people in a laboratory, as I mentioned in my talk, expected utility theory doesn't do any well, and nor do the other behavioral theories that are being proposed. So we don't have a theory that's any good at predicting what ordinary people do and put in a laboratory under laboratory conditions. But ordinary people aren't accustomed to being in laboratories. Okay? And when they buy a car, there's a Swedish economist whose name I've forgotten for the moment, who wrote a very interesting paper many years ago, in which he studied a number of graduate students who were interested in buying a second-hand car. And he made second-hand cars available. And in those days, you probably remember, you're probably graduate students yourselves in those days, and you remember how expensive they were. And they studied these cars very, very carefully, because if they won the competition, they would get to choose which of these second-hand cars. And their behavior was very rational indeed, even though they weren't economists or mathematicians. Right? And so you find, and when my wife and I bought houses, so I'm sure it's the same with you, and you think very carefully about it, right? And even in finance, I mean, there are models in finance of herd behavior which show that it's actually costly to study the financial papers, to follow what's going on, And a lot of the time, the rational thing to do is just to copy other people. But then when something happens in the market, some unexpected things happens in the market, the people who just copy are left hanging in the air. And I don't know how good herd behavior theories are because I haven't made a proper study, but when you see the graphs of how the market adjusts to catastrophes, it's tracked pretty well by these herd theories. So it isn't, you mustn't think, everybody is doing their own thinking. It's the same with habits. A lot of the time with habits, people are copying other people's behavior. And this is rational too, to copy other people's behavior in certain circumstances. And so, let's be more sophisticated how we think about these things. There's so much that we don't understand. And let's not throw out the little bits that we do understand because they don't explain everything. Let's hold on to what we've got that works sometimes and try to build it up.
Well, that's hard to disagree with. But just looking at the little model up there, so we're going to buy a house. What do we desire? Well, we have a family with 2 children, might get a 3rd child, so maybe a 4-bedroom house. Well, that's sort of expensive. So maybe we should move to the suburbs to get a 4-bedroom house. Then we have to get information about the prices. We have to look at the houses for each of them. We have to get an expert to come and look at the house, get information to form reasonably solid beliefs. We shouldn't spend too much time on that because then someone else might pick up the house. But nevertheless, we need to get information and so on. So this is trivial, and it fits that model perfectly. We shouldn't be under the influence of wishful thinking. We shouldn't fall in love with houses. I've done that a few times. Unfortunately, in France, there's you can angrefrist. They say within a week you can change your mind. Whereas in Norway, with its phone auctions, once you get a house, you're stuck with it. You cannot change your mind. So you shouldn't you shouldn't fall in love with a house because then you don't do the necessary investment to find it about hidden flaws. Is there maybe a nightclub next door, or are there termites in the house, or whatever? So, but this is what this model is about, and I think it's trivial, and I think it's hard to contest, frankly, because it's so trivial. Like methodological individualism, which is also utterly trivial.
Crystal.
My name is Crystal Fricke, and I'm a philosopher. Thank you for your talk, and thank you for the comments. I really appreciate your objection to obscurity in the social sciences and the humanities. I was brought up by experts for German idealism and suffered from people whose teaching was obscure, and discovered that they always hoped that other people would think they would be wise. But I have a problem with the way you present the standards for good social science. You say you want explanations, ideally causal explanations that allow successful predictions.
Retrodictions.
Sorry?
Retrodictions.
Yes. And I wonder whether that is based on a positivistic understanding of science and causality. I mean, it reminds me of Descartes' clear and distinct concepts. And remember that Descartes ultimately relied on God for securing truth. It reminds me of Kant's idea of causality, where you have causes and effects in a linear order, but there is also something like system causality. And I had to think of Nancy Cartwright's warning that causal thinking is always dependent on luck, that the silent assumption of everything else being equal is true. And even seemingly very clear causal explanations depend to a large extent on luck. And whether we get to the truth on that basis is an open question. So clarity, in contrast to obscurity, is a matter of style rather than of truth. And you have yourself relied on Jane Austen, who is one of my favorite authors, and it reveals that there can be truth in fictional narratives. So we should not look with disdain on the production of narratives. I think ultimately that's what we do. But the narratives can be clearer and less clear, and they can be more helpful and less helpful. Thank you.
I'm a great fan of Nancy Cartwright's philosophy explanation, and her idea of propensities, objective propensities, rather than causes, is very close to my idea of mechanisms. I corresponded with her at some point, and she said, yes, it seems as if your ideas about social science are very close to my ideas about physics, which of course I couldn't understand, because it's about quantum mechanics, which nobody understands, as I said. Anyway, so now the luck thing I frankly did not understand, how luck enters into causality or causal explanations. I think, of course, luck matters in everything in life, including in science, but how luck systematically enters into the scientific process, I don't understand. Now, about Jane Austen, what I think about Jane Austen is not that there's any truth in Pride and Prejudice, because there's no fact of the matter. These are just fictional people. We cannot look out the window and see what they're doing right now. But they can make general points like poetry will kill us a faint love but stimulate an ardent love. And we can ask whether that brief throwaway remark by Elizabeth Bennet actually might be a starting point for a scientific hypothesis. And then are La Rochefoucauld and Jane Austen right in thinking that affection, romantic love, can be affected in these two different ways, depending on the strength of the love. The effect of either absence or poetry can go one way or the other. And this can be generalized probably to other things. Just an interesting thought, uttered, as I said, a throwaway remark by Elizabeth Bennet, which I think can be then turned into a scientific hypothesis and studied. So that's what I meant. But of course, there's not a single sentence in Pride and Prejudice that is either true or false, because there's no fact of the matter. We cannot look out of the window.
Yep, sure.
Sorry, I always have a different opinion. If you wanted to have a commentator on physics who was utterly, totally wrong, Nancy Cartwright. You couldn't have chosen a better example of someone not to follow. Anyway, what I really want to say about quantum physics is very, very interesting to look at this last year, slit experiments, where the electron doesn't go through this slit or that slit, but somehow it contrives to go through both slits at once. And these modern experiments, they're unexplainable if you insist on the classical notion of causality. It's as though the future is causing the past, and it cannot be. There's something wrong, when applied to the real world in how we think about causality. It isn't like we proceed in ordinary life. I have a very good friend who's one of the experimenters in quantum physics, and he tells me sometimes he believes on causality. On Mondays he believes on causality, and on Tuesday he doesn't. So even the people doing these experiments don't know what's happening. What's clearly true is the traditional way we think about causality isn't right, not at that level. And probably it's not right at the level that we employ. It's got to right in a kind of generalized way. He wants to speak.
Well, I think, yeah, I'd like to say something about the way I think we social scientists have to work. It's operating at the macro level. Basically, I think if we are going to go the road of methodological individualism, the best we can do is to use folk psychology appropriately modified and refined. Neuropsychology is economics and so on are fascinating and interesting, but I think we are very far away from being able to use them in a sort of robust, stable, reproducible way. So as I said, folk psychology, whether something is intelligible, a certain mechanism is intelligible. When, as I to repeat what I said in the talk, when I see something I cannot have, there are two possible reactions. Oh, I must have that. Or, no, since I cannot have it. Or, since I cannot have it, it's not worth having. And both are intelligible, both happen all the time. And we cannot tell ahead of time which it is. But these are proverbs. I've written quite a bit about proverbs, how they encapsulate folk wisdom and sometimes folk mistakes. Many proverbs are actually mistaken in what they say about human nature. For instance, proverbs tend to impute greater consistency to people than they actually display. Who steals a penny will steal a pound, or whatever. These statements are not true. There's much less consistency in cross-situational consistency than folk psychology assumes. But by and large, folk psychology is pretty good. So, for instance, if you are given a small gift, you feel grateful. If you are given a large gift, you feel resentful. This is something that moralists knew 2,000 years ago, and which is probably true and can be tested.
Folk psychology is pretty good.
It's good that you agree
Folk
on something.
psychology is indeed pretty good.
But on the other hand, I mean, even if you stick to the methodological individualist outlook, you're going to have to take other factors into account, such as context. For example, I mean, I think probably one of the more successful attempts by evolutionary psychologists to identify human universals is the notion of the free rider detector module, which has been identified time and again using various methods. One of the most famous methods is the so-called Wason test, where one uses a set of cards in order to detect, whether or not people are able to identify free riders and parasites, people who want to reap the benefit without paying the cost. And to me, it's quite convincing. I think this is probably a near universal, or even a universal, that we human beings do not like people who want to reap the benefit without paying the cost, as it were. But then the problematic question is when you go to study it empirically, because it turns out that in each and every society there would be different interpretations, different views, different descriptions of who the parasites are. Who are the free riders? Are the free riders people who are on welfare benefits? Or are they the very rich people who don't pay tax, for example? There's not going to be any agreement on that. So the folk psychology, those sort of pithy insights that you get from proverbs and from sayings is just the beginning. And the moment you start to study it empirically, it gets muddled, because there isn't one, as it were, view, or one interpretation, or even one description of the world.
Good. Andreas?
Andreas Lohndal, philosopher at the University of Oslo. Thank you again for very stimulating presentations, giving us lots of new issues to think about, explored in part already by the other members at the table. One of the things you said that was puzzling when you just said it, and I wanted to explore a bit more, is you said rational choice theory cannot explain preference change, which seems plausible. What seems less plausible is your claim no theory can do so, if I understood correctly. And of course, it would be, I think, interesting and helpful, at least for me, to explore what is your thinking about that issue. I think it might help us understand a bit better. So what counts as a theory? What counts as an explanation if if it is not possible, or if you are not aware of any theory that at least aspires to explain preference change. There would be two examples that I have in mind, just to help clarify my own, how I am to assess your claim. Some of us have spent some time on mechanisms or the method of reflective equilibrium as a mode of adjusting your preferences on the basis of information and to ensure consistency and coherence. So the arrows would go in further ways than in the strict rational choice. That might or might not count as a theory, or it might or might not count as an explanation in your sense. That would be an interesting elaboration. And the second is that this might be an implication of what you said very early on, that this is your commitment to a correspondence theory of truth. Now, it may be that a coherence theory of truth, or within that family, would yield other sorts of understandings of what counts as an explanation, what counts as a theory. But neither of these might actually be theories in the sense you choose to use that term. So again, your use of what counts as a theory would have to include, it seems, a correspondence theory of truth.
If you think that ethical views are preferences, one can indeed maybe ask what are rational preferences in the following way, adopted as you did from Rawls. So we start with some kind of intuitive notion about good distributions, for instance, which seems good in abstract, for instance, maximize total utility in society, assuming that can be operationally determined. But then we think about individual situations, specific cases. For instance, can we really justify killing one person at random to save the lives of 5 by transplantation, assuming that this could be done in secret so that people don't have to worry all the time about being selected for this killing? So, well, maybe utilitarianism wasn't so good after all. Maybe we have to modify it in some way, or maybe it turns out that it cannot be modified. That's what Rawls argued. So we have to choose. So back and forth between theories and intuitions about particular cases until in the end, hopefully, there's a perfect coherence, to use your term, between what we believe in individual cases and the general theory we can use to justify those. I don't think that really overlaps very much with explanation, which is my concern. So we cannot explain or predict preference change. We cannot predict. We can explain it by retrodiction, as in the example I gave from the Israeli boy. We can, in retrospect, we can see what does it do. Did the hatred dominate in his reaction, or the fear? That would be a retroactive mechanism-based explanation of preferences, but not prediction for the reasons I've indicated. So, but once again, I cannot really see how this search for coherence between intuitions about specific cases and theory of general cases overlaps with scientific explanation of facts or patterns of facts. But maybe I'm missing something.
I'm on the other side again. I mean, it isn't true that people don't study change of preferences. It only seems so to Jon because he won't consider adaptive behavior as part of social science. In fact, I have a book in which I do it myself. It's called Game Theory and the Social Contract, and you might think of it as an attempt to rewrite John Rawls' theory of justice in evolutionary terms. And the preferences which adapt over time are empathetic preferences, the kind of preferences that people have when they say, I would rather be Jon Elster receiving this medal than poor Ken Binmore always being on the wrong side. Right? But as if that would be an empathetic preference. And in my book, not only in my work, it's quite common. One studies the change of preferences in an evolutionary way. And nobody has done it very successfully because obviously it's very hard to do. But It's not because people aren't trying to do it, and we shouldn't pretend that it doesn't happen.
Well, one shouldn't use arguments from authority, although I've done so already, by relying on David Friedman for my skepticism about statistics, skepticism that can fortunately endorse this. Yeah. But here's an argument from authority. Some years ago, there was a handbook published in Political Economy, and the editors decided to have Kenneth Arrow, second to none, answer questions from selected, from some persons the editor selected, including myself. So I asked Ken Arrow the following question: what does economics have to say about preference change? And he said, essentially nothing. So that's argument from authority. Now, of course, we can say a lot of things, small things, about preference change, but a general theory about preference formation and preference change with predictive power, I think, is very far from. But I think Ken Arrow had in mind predictive explanations. I have in mind non-predictive retrodictions. There we can say a lot about intelligible ways in which preferences are formed and changed, such as the fear-hatred example, such as conformism versus non-conformism. Some people are obsessively conformist, some are obsessively non-conformist. They are, of course, conformist in their own way, because they too have to look over their shoulders all the time. But these are two different reactions, and we cannot tell really ahead of time. To take an example that's been discussed, analyzed empirically, whether children of an alcoholic will become a teetotaler or an alcoholic. Two extreme reactions. Of course, some will be neither.
But you can't really, I mean, these kinds of things can't really be predicted, can they? I mean, one of the things that we've been exploring is why it is that siblings who grow up together end up so different, you know, in terms of their careers, in terms of their values and so on. But preferences do change, and in important ways. And I would say, you know, preferences and values change. I mean, the basis of choices change, so that the shift towards more vegetarianism, for example, and veganism in our part of the world, the shift towards the electric car, which has been fairly dramatic and quite unanticipated, it needs to be understood. Not least if we're going to, you know, come to terms with some of the issues that concern us, not only as social scientists, but also as citizens. And that is the big question, isn't it? What is it that makes people change their minds? Is it new knowledge? Doesn't seem like it. New experiences, your neighbor, probably a mix of all of these things. If you think about the growth of the new political movements across Europe, also completely unanticipated, the total decline of social democracy, which has taken place in just a couple of decades. Nobody would have thought that, you know, just as nobody predicted the fall of the Soviet Empire around 1988. So we need that kind of research, and we need psychology, you know, to be on board for this.
And on that note, I think we should move on, since I have four more people
I've
on
got
my
to
list.
respond.
One.
You know, alas, Ken Arrow is dead. And he died quite a long time ago. He was very, very supportive when I needed money to set up my centre in London, the Centre for Economic Learning and Social Evolution. And I don't doubt that when you heard him speak, it was true. But that was a long time ago.
5 years ago he died.
Yeah, and but I endorse, you know, the great Ken Arrow. Yeah.
Olaf?
Yes, thank you. I'm Olav Gjelsvik. I'm also a philosopher. I think much of the discussion and agreement and disagreement here sort of surrounds the connection between prediction and explanation. So I want all of you to comment a little bit on that. You could think very intuitively that what a good explanation of an event does is to provide something like knowledge why it occurs. And then there's a further issue about how do we get that sort of knowledge. I think Ken Binmore is the one who most clearly thinks that we need something like a theory that's able to predict the occurrence of that event in a proper way. And then you have various degrees among the other panelists about how to capture some notion of knowledge why something happens, even if you have nothing like prediction. So I want to ask all of you about how do you think about the way your approach to this issue about when you have knowledge of why something happens and when you don't have, how that matches into. So that's a general epistemological question, but that seems to me to be the crucial issue, and I agree with you. In the cases where you have something like a predictive theory, we're fine, but how far can you sort of move away from something like that and still think you're doing something that is deserving of the name of social science? I think there are lots of other ways of knowing that maybe not amount to social science, but that's a different issue. So I just want to challenge you all three a little bit on how do you think, is this an important question? Should we have some sort of general view on the borderline issues here or not?
And brief replies, please. Brief.
If you're an economic engineer, you don't need to explain if you can predict. So, for instance, Gary Becker wrote a famous article in 1961 on how you can predict consumption behavior as a function of price. And of course, there's a rational choice explanation, but there are also other explanations. So partly people change their consumption pattern when prices changes because their opportunities change. The feasible set changes. Maybe they even choose randomly. Even then, they are constrained by what they can afford to buy. And Becker showed that on these three different macro foundations, rational choice, randomization, and tradition, let's say, you get the same result. So you can predict the same thing, and then you don't have to care about the precise mechanism that generates these results. So that's, I think many economists would go along with that. They care about predictions, and they don't really care necessarily about the macro foundations of the predictions.
I'm going to try and make a philosophical answer. Now, I don't know how much this opinion is shared by other economists, but it's possible that there is some kind of language in which you could state propositions about the universe and assign truth values, true or false, to them that would describe the universe. Okay, this would be truth, and it's possible not. It's possible that's not so. Okay, so that truth doesn't have a metaphysical meaning, but this is irrelevant to us because this is way beyond our. All we have are models. All we have are models, and I'm very big admirer of Epicurus. Okay? Epicurus says we must tolerate even models that contradict each other. I think we should, and physicists do, because the theory of relativity contradicts the theory of quantum physics, and the physicists don't give a damn. What the physicists think is this one predicts well here, that one predicts there. They can't both be true because they contradict each other, but who cares, right? And I think the same. And this is part of the disagreement between you and myself. I'm willing to tolerate multiple models, even if they contradict each other. I don't think the truth is anywhere near our grasp. And we have to tolerate models that contradict each other and say, this one works well here, this one works well there. We haven't got any models that work there. And to ask for more than that is to ask for more than is within human grasp, at least right now. I don't know, does that count as philosophy? I'm doing my best.
I think I did disagree with this, but let's move very quickly. Strange enough, I think in my part of the world we're more concerned with the micro foundations than with the predictions. Quite opposite to what you were saying, because we've given up on predictions a long time ago. In the mid 20th century, there were some ambitious anthropologists who tried to produce a natural science of society. The most famous one was Radcliffe Brown, a British anthropologist, gave a series of lectures in Chicago, eventually published as a book. And his students loyally, really good, some of the best in their generation, they loyally tried to follow up his program to unveil and discover and account for those natural laws of society, and they gave up. And in a lecture given in 1949 at the University of Oxford, his sort of most influential student, Evans Pritchard, spoke about social anthropology and history, arguing that we should try to emulate the historians more than the natural scientists in order to give realistic accounts of the fullness of social life. So that's one. I mean, that's one way. That's one way of looking at this. So I think, you know, we're clearly not very good at making predictions on the whole. I mean, the social sciences. I mean, maybe at the micro level, maybe at the level of the human condition. You know, because we do two things. We study the human condition and we study the world. And then there is a sort of a gap often between those two that we try somehow to bridge. And when it comes to the human condition, yeah, we can understand that. But it's hard to predict how any individual will act. I mean, this is an old chestnut in the social philosophy of social sciences, isn't it? But when it comes to predicting developments in the world, even more difficult. There's even more complexity. So we're good with postdictions, but bad with predictions, I would say.
Do you want to say something briefly?
The last time I looked, the most well-established law in social sciences was that the higher people's income, the lower the proportion spent on food.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we only have like, 7 minutes left. So brief questions and brief answers, please.
Yes. Thank you. Morten Egeberg, Emeritus Political Science. I actually think we can explain and predict preference change. If we change a decision maker's organizational position, we can most likely explain and predict her preference changes. If you move a person from the Ministry of Climate Change to the Ministry of Enterprise, we know relatively well that this person changes her preferences. If you move a national minister to become a European commissioner, we know that this person changes his preferences. Thank you very much.
Preferences or expressed preferences?
Actual and expressed preferences. Thank you.
Eivind.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the presentations and the discussion so far. I have a question to Jon. I would like to know how much of a purist you are. How much of a purist you are. How radical your views really are. I think that if the hard or the soft obscurantists monopolized social science, it would be a catastrophe. So I basically agree with your critique of both of them. Still, I tend to think that hard obscurantists occasionally come up with good ideas, that they have correlations which are interesting, and that they could be used in another framework, perhaps than their own, but still interesting. I also tend to think that some of the soft obscurantists have Pierre Bourdieu in mind, often say interesting things about the distinction, interesting things about cultural capital, even if it isn't really capital. I think there are some interesting points, and I would like to know whether you agree. Could you cite them without a polemical sort of note in addition? Or have you examples of interesting things said by what you call a hard and a soft obscurantist? I'm just curious about this. Thank you.
Well, that's not a question for a short answer. Well, some of what you said reminded me of something that Thomas said in his first response, I think, namely that bullshit can be justified if it generates non-bullshit. Well, anything can be justified on those grounds. So I think that's being too generous. Well, I think there's a lot of very good history out there being written, and which is often and for instance, I've been very influenced and stimulated recent years both by Hume's History of England and by Gibbon. given, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. These are actually, you know, psychologists en bas la lettre. They are very inventive and full of hypotheses that remain to be explored about all sorts of issues. But will I accept hard and soft obscurantism because, like the proverbial blind hen, they can find a bit of what is called in English? Some grain. Yeah, yes, blind hens can find grain, but that's not the reason for blinding them. So.
Kalle.
My name is Kalle Mone, economics. I have some questions to sort of the generality of hard obscurantism. In economics, I think there's a development in all directions simultaneously. As people are moving around for a good thing sometimes, and maybe bad on other things. But I think it is be interesting to hear more nuances about the different things. In development economics, for example, there's a lot of case studies, all the way from studies in the slum, studies in the rural areas. They're very concrete, very case-based. It resembles social anthropology, old social anthropology at its best, I hope. But so that's one thing. I would like to hear more nuances that about hard obscurantism, more true in some cases than in others. And secondly, preferences. I think, at least when it comes to the value aspect of preferences, I think there are many attempts to try to explain them. So it'd be interesting to hear, for example, motivated beliefs or value consonance, things like that. To hear discussions of that. I think there's a lot of motivated beliefs among everybody, I guess. And once you have sort of invested in one belief, then you have this sunk cost fallacy that you don't give it up, and people stay with their beliefs even though they see evidence that it's not true. Finally, I would say that identification that hasn't been mentioned. I think there's a very clear prediction in identification that is maybe too general. I think most people identify with a similar sort of themselves. Middle class identify with middle class in other countries, in other areas. Upper class identify with other upper class. But the poor people in the world, they never identify with themselves. Because it's tough, it's hard to identify with other people who suffer. So they identify with the football team, the nation, religion, and so on. I think it seems to be a very solid pattern. And for good reasons, it has to do with pleasure and pain, and can be used as explanations of at least that part of preferences that you identify with others. Thank you.
Well, in motivated belief formation, the causal arrow goes from the motivation, which remains constant, to the belief that is changed. But that is not explaining the motivation or the preference. But sometimes you can go the other way, from the belief to the motivation. So sour grapes, I can't get it, so I don't want it. That's from belief to preferences. But that's just one mechanism among many, many, many. What Arrow denied could exist was a general theory of preference formation that would then enable prediction.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. We are now going to break for lunch. The lunch break is 1.5 hours. Please be back at 2:30, and all the discussions can continue over lunch. Lunch is across the hallway. Thank you.